Hello, welcome to the second day of Queer Feminist Perspectives, Political Homophobia and Anti-Semitism in the Middle East and Europe conference. This is a digital conference over 2 days, September 24th, 25th, 2021. We organized this conference at the Humboldt University of Berlin, Department of Diversity and Social Conflict, in cooperation with Brown University Center for Middle East Studies and Heinrich Böll Foundation. The second day keynote is Professor Phillip Ayoub. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce him today. Phillip Ayoub is Associate Professor in the Department of Diplomacy and World Affairs at Occidental College and Fellow in the Center for International Security at the Hertie School. Welcome, Phillip.
Thank you.
Phillip also serves as Associate Editor of the European Journal of Politics and Gender. He received his PhD from the Department of Government at Cornell University in 2013, after obtaining a BA from the University of Washington and MA degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Cornell University. He also spent a year as Max Weber Fellow in the Department of Political and Social Sciences at the European University Institute and 4 years as an assistant and associate professor at the Department of Politics in Drexel University. His research bridges insights from international relations and comparative politics, engaging with literature on transnational politics, sexuality and gender, norm diffusion, and the study of social movements. He's particularly interested in how transnational mobilization of marginalized peoples and international channels of visibility influence socio-legal changes across states. His book, titled When States Come Out, Europe's Sexual Minorities and the Politics of Visibility, was published by Cambridge University Press in April 2016. It uses a mixed method approach, combining large and quantitative analysis with in-depth qualitative analysis of key cases in order to explore the domestic conditions under which international norms governing LGBT rights are most likely to spread. I also saw a piece by Phillip Ayoub today in the Washington Post, just before the German elections. It's on gender politics of Angela Merkel. Very interesting piece. So if you're interested in German politics, you are welcome to read it in the Washington Post today. It's a pleasure to have you here, Phillip. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I have to say, it's just an immense pleasure and also really, truly an honor to be invited to be part of this fantastic conference with so many exceptional scholars. I've really enjoyed listening to all the great presentations over the last 2 days. And I also really want to thank Gökçe, Kati, Nadia, Tunay, and also Frankie, Bella, Alex, Barbara for all of their really hard work organizing this important conference. And just on a personal note, which I usually don't do, but I think it's fine here, you know, as the son of migrants from a German mother and a father from Palestine, Jordan, and we moved to the States during my childhood. But there are so many themes in this conference that are just deeply important to me, both on a personal level and also a professional one. And so it's just been really thrilling to see something like this organized in a space like this for us created. And I mean, I should note at the outset that, you know, most of my work so far has been on Europe, even though with Saada Chan, we are starting we're doing a project that is moving me a little bit also back to my roots in the Middle East. But today I will focus on my more existing scholarship on social movements and IR as a political scientist that has looked mainly at European integration. And I want to use my time to reflect on a few areas of research that I thought dovetailed with the conference, both in terms of transnationalism and also in terms of resistance and resilience. So, you know, I've studied, and I should share my screen, I guess now. Sorry, let me do that. All right. So I've studied the effect of transnational movements and international norms on the diffusion of LGBTI rights, but my talk today is going to try to connect to some of the discussions we've had yesterday and earlier today also in the role of, how transnational ties are formed through migration, as well as right-wing backlash to the hard work that these activists have done. And as such, I want to structure this keynote presentation in 4 parts. And I'll just try to, sorry, I'm trying to move my screen here, which is blocking my talk. Okay. I've tried to structure this in 4 parts, the first of which is going to talk about transnational activism and the deployment of international norms that have introduced a new and innovative framework around LGBT rights in many European states, including Central and Eastern European states in the last 2 decades. And then I want to talk about the sources, the transnational sources of these ties, to explain how they're often established by queer migrants who have a unique and I think transformational perspective on navigating sexuality across a diversity of contexts and cultural settings. And these are the actors that sometimes put new countries onto the agenda of existing activist organizations to broker new understandings of queerness across borders. After I make that case, in the 3rd part, I'd like to talk then about backlash to those efforts and to those rights, both in the domestic and global sphere, before returning to the LGBTQ movement to look at how LGBTI activists respond to and how they actively attempt to push to respond to the attempts to challenge and retrench their rights in contemporary politics. And one of the cases that came up a lot today that I've also spent a lot of time in the field working in is the Polish case, which many of our colleagues have presented on today. So I will go back in time a little bit to talk about some earlier periods of that really important movement. And together, these 4 parts, they pull together 4 strands of some recent work. The first drawing more on my book that Gökçe mentioned. And the second part draws on a 2019 article in the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, which was co-authored with Lauren Bauman, who is my student, who's now actually a PhD student at UNC, doing really great work. And then the third part draws on a piece that I wrote in a book called, of other scholars called Protein Power, which looks at resistance movements, and it connects with my work with Christina Stöckel that we're doing on transnational networks of anti-gender and anti-LGBT activism. And then finally, the last part deals with my work with Agnieszka Czytaj, who's a wonderful scholar of LGBTI movements in Poland, and we had a joint study in social movement studies that I will draw on for that part. So just to give also credit to my co-authors in these journeys that we did together. And so I always think back on my mentor who said, always present just one idea and do it well. And I'm definitely not following that advice by doing 4 different ideas here, but I think I can connect a thread through them in a way that connects to the conference. So I hope that this works and that you bear with me in that process. All right, so to start out on kind of an optimistic or a more optimistic level, if we look at, many ways we can look at the development of the LGBTI rights regime in recent years with, in somewhat of an impressive way that in the last 2 decades, the LGBTI movement has gained in momentum that is arguably unprecedented in speed and suddenness, including its gains in new rights codified in law in many different countries. Of course, we'll talk about the limitations of those rights and also the new exclusions that they introduced, but their proliferation in their own right came as a surprise to many, both activists on the ground and scholars looking at them. During the decade when I was working first on my PhD and then later my book, so from the early mid-2000s until about 2016, there were a lot of surprises that came about that were unanticipated at the beginning of that journey versus the end. And I would be amazed by things like, the small Catholic island of Ireland introducing by popular vote marriage equality, or the small island of Malta becoming a trailblazer on trans recognition. A lot of these countries didn't look like the countries that we would have anticipated to make those kind of moves just a little while earlier. And so this really emphasized that there was something transnational going on here, that so many varied states, including ones that many observers thought of as as highly unlikely to adopt these kind of laws would adopt elements of LGBTI rights into the framework of the state. And what was shocking about these new types of cases and sometimes misfits was that they moved us a bit away from earlier scholarship that had focused predominantly on domestic explanations of LGBTI rights proliferation. So a lot of those cases looked at countries like the Netherlands or Sweden, and they focused on explanatory factors like the religious cultural context, often looking at more secular states or Protestant states that had become more secular, or states that were quite wealthy economically, or states that had very high levels of democratization or had long histories with women's movements and other social movement capacity that had led to the introduction of these rights. Yet the diversity of states that promote LGBT rights in Europe today, and also in many other parts of the world, muddled some of those theories, and that they introduced new kinds of states that were making those changes that didn't look like the ones that we had initially theorized. And as Kelly Coleman, who's done really important work on this, has said, it wasn't a mere coincidence that we saw these kind of rights pop up in multiple dozens of states. So for example, marriage equality, which existed nowhere not long ago, was now apparent in some form versus in partnership or full marriage equality in over 20 European states. So there's something international that's going on alongside these domestic factors. And that's a little bit also then where, my work comes in, which was trying to explain what are these channels that are leading, what are these transnational channels that might be leading to these changes in multiple places in a similar period of time. And I try to think about this concept of norms, which we talk about a lot in IR, but try to think of the ways that norms might be more visible in some contexts than others. And so to say that the felt intensity of a norm might vary across space depending on certain conditions of the state. And I theorize 3 channels of visibility that might make states more porous to a given norm around LGBTI rights. And the 3 that I look at are social channels, which are the circulation, of new ideas, information, and images. So this could be, for example, through the media, new conceptions of self or queerness that travel across borders. A lot of movements also use the internet to organize in certain ways. Next, I look at political channels, so the porousness or openness of the states to their international societies of states. So that, for example, looks at integration into intergovernmental organizations like the EU or Europe that can place certain kinds of political pressure on the state. And then finally, for me, which is the most important channel that I focus a lot on, is a mediated channel. I refer to this channel as made up of norm brokers, which are domestic activists that are embedded in transnational activist networks or advocacy networks. And what's really important about them is that they are local. And that's something that I really try to emphasize, is that they are local actors who also have one foot in this kind of transnational game, and that they're also involved in this organizing, so that they can take they can gain some support and best practice, et cetera, from the global sphere, but they know how to reshape it and frame it and package it for distinct audiences. Because as we all know, these are very contentious norms, and they're also very specific in different contexts how these norms should be advocated for. And activists who are local have a good sense, a better sense of how to navigate that process, as we'll be talking about a lot today. So just one way to kind of give an image of what is this international norm kind of depiction from international relations look like. This is a cartoon, and since we are in this weekend of the German elections and Angela Merkel stepping down, you see here a cartoon from 2015 that was published in a German paper after the Irish voted to introduce marriage equality, and it shows an Irish couple passing a bouquet that says gay marriage, and Angela Merkel, who's the leader of a conservative center-right party, is trying not to catch it because she didn't want to deal with the issue. However, this kind of pressure, when, even from her own party, folks were saying that, that's kind of embarrassing that the Irish could get to this human rights benchmark before a country like Germany that claims to really, in the post-war period, adhere to kind of international standards on human rights. It put a lot of pressure on her to adopt marriage equality in Germany, which she then would release the party whip, at least, even though she voted against it herself, knowing full well that it would lead to the introduction of marriage equality in Germany. And there's a lot of other examples of these kind of international and transnational processes, like the European Court of Justice that has responded to activist claims to introduce new kinds of rules for states to abide to, that has led to proliferation of legal changes in many European countries. And just to show you, this is the last regression table I will show you, but just to show you some statistical output. If we look at countries in Europe, new adopter countries, so those are the countries that joined the European Union in 2004 or after 2004, so 2004 and 7. This analysis doesn't include Croatia, which came later, but you see that in those new adopter states that a lot of these transnational channels, so the degree to which countries are more porous on the basis of these international ties, has led to higher rates of adoption of LGBTI legislation. And so a lot of the earlier characteristics that we saw as serious impediments that we saw as explanatory in first mover states are still important, but they're not as explanatory as these international ties in these new adopter states. So I want to, one of the things that became quickly apparent to me while doing the interviews for the work on that transnational movement and process was that oftentimes I was sitting in front of people who had very mobile histories of their own, and this really inspired new research into the relationship between queer migration and networks of transnational activism in Europe, since such mobility through migration or extended periods of time abroad contributed to new and unique continental ties between multinational queer activists, in many cases even through, for example, romantic relationships between people that formed post-migration that explained the emergence of new cross-border networks for mobilization, often putting new countries on the map based on the presence of activists with multinational backgrounds. And the question that we wanted to look at, that Lauren Bauman and I were asking was, to what extent does migration facilitate the mobilization of these transnationally linked social movement organizations? So what shifts the perspective of social movements to other countries transnationally? And one of the things that we wanted to argue was that migrant inflows increase the propensity for social movement organizations to orient their focus beyond the state, often dedicated to promoting queer rights in migrant activists' home countries. And we tried to think of this mechanism that was driving this relationship, which is another type of norm brokerage performed by queer migrant activists, which refers to them reconciling differences in understanding of sexuality, of gender identity, and queerness across borders, because their experience in these multiple settings that they've navigated as multiply rooted peoples plays a central role in connecting conceptions of queer identities in their host and home states and states they've left behind, especially when these conceptions clash. And we think this might change the landscape of queer activism in Europe and form new forms of solidarity across borders. And I think this might ring true for many of the people here in this conference, that we're always conscious of navigating spaces and navigating gender and sexuality in spaces that we're in, and queer migrants do that in many kinds of spaces, and it helps. It has helped orient transnational activism in a certain way of trying to think about how these identities fit across and travel across space. And one of the things I should note that motivated this as well was that we live in a time when many radical right parties are presenting migration as or weaponizing gay rights to levy anti-immigrant politics. And this was something that Lauren and I were thinking about when we were writing this paper, that we really wanted to show how essential migration and queer migration has been to the transformational activism that we have, or that I was working on in earlier phases of my work on kind of the diffusion of these rights or changes in attitudes, that migration has been so essential for this important progress that we celebrate. So then when you have politicians of the right saying that they are motivated to protect their national gays and lesbians against migrants who are so-called homophobic, this was something that was deeply troubling, this rhetoric, which obviously still exists to a large degree. And we really wanted to make a case that was unfounded. And one of the, the qualitative case that I'll mention from that paper was related to Polish migrants in Berlin. And this was rooted out of research in the mid-2000s. And I know many of the papers we had today, like from Mata and Magdalena, or from Pavel and Tomasz, on contemporary political homophobia and transphobia in Poland. This has been going on for a long time, and a lot of those similar dynamics have happened earlier. And one of the early waves around 2005 to 7, when activists in Poland faced really intense state-sponsored repression and societal discrimination, it really mobilized queer Polish migrant communities in other parts of Europe. Like John Binney and Christian Klesse have looked at migrants in the UK. I was doing work on organizers in Berlin that were organizing buses and bringing people to marches, et cetera, and helping campaigns from these other locations. And they were these kind of, activists that are transnational actors that are referred to in the literature as rooted in that they engage across borders, utilizing both these domestic and international spaces to further a common goal that is often shared with transnational allies. And these actors aren't merely products of their homeland, nor complete byproducts of integration, but instead maintain connections whether physical, mental, or emotional, to home, while being shaped by their new environments. And this was indeed something that a lot of Polish migrants in Berlin were talking about, as they were really troubled by what was going on in Poland, and it motivated them and politicized them in new ways. And in Germany, we saw around that time a proliferation of new organizations that were focused on Poland, or the reorienting of existing ones that hadn't been focused on Poland before, to also pay attention to political homophobia there. And the activists described this, quote unquote, distance for self-discovery, which I think a lot of queer people have also, in terms of distance from familiar spaces in order to figure out ways to express themselves, that migration made that possible for them in a way that politicized them. And we saw this in the formation of certain groups like Tolerancja po polsku, or Tolerancja w Polnisch, the Equality Foundation, the Warsaw Pact, that were doing activism, cross-border activism between Germany and Poland, due to these migrants' identities that were shaped by both their interaction with novel social and political conditions, as well as the varied presence of queer space, expression, and visibility. So it led to this interesting and new kind of galvanized activism that I think plays into some of the factors that I presented before on the proliferation of rights. And indeed, when we look at this quantitatively as well, here we did see that countries with higher migrant inflows, actually, it does correlate with the increase of more transnationally embedded social movement organizations. So those norm brokers that I presented before, those domestic organizations that become involved in transnational activism, we do see that countries that have more migration are the ones that will be more likely to do that. We know from social movement theory that more resource-rich countries are more likely to have social movement organizations, as well as more urbanized countries are. Those factors are still significant, but even when controlling for those factors and a series of others, we see that migration is also, in a quantitative sense, really important. And you can see just some very basic scatter plots here between the migrant inflows and the expansion of transnationally oriented social movement organizations. And it's not a story that's just isolated to Polish migration. We also did interviews with various groups, including, for example, Maruf in the Netherlands, which works to create kind of visible spaces for queer Muslims in the Netherlands, and creates kind of a reciprocal and very dynamic social movement work on new understandings of sexuality and gender identity. And again, this we saw as politically important when you have folks like here, this quote from Get Builders that is using, this politically homophobic strategy of Islamophobia, where he is saying in this quote, that gay people would support him because they experience on a day-to-day basis some kind of a threat that he's constructing that are posed by migrants. And we see this in many countries, of course. For folks in the US, we definitely dealt with this with kind of the Trump pride right-wing kind of mobilization with folks in his administration like Rick Grenell, or here in Germany with Alice Weidel, the co-chair of the far-right Alternative for Germany party that is interestingly in a binational lesbian relationship, yet has used her homosexuality as a way to justify her anti-immigrant policies. And I think again that this very false perception and dichotomy between migration and LGBTI rights that exists in these far-right movements and has diffused somewhat into the popular narrative is actually really missing a much larger part of the story and much more accurate one. And that this was, I think, important for us in this work. So, while the first part of this talk has made a strong case for the effect of transnational movements that they have on the ability of norms to become visible and salient in the domestic discourse, unfortunately, resistance and political homo and transphobia is present at all levels in this work, both at local level or at local levels, national levels, and globally, as so many of the presentations in these last days have correctly presented. And before I talk about this resistance, I also just want to highlight that many of these rights that we talk about, or these quote unquote successful rights, are also only a success for certain LGBTI people. And I think that's a really important caveat that we have to think about, how not everyone has benefited from this rights revolution, in that there are still, if we look at it intersectionally, there are huge differences amongst communities on the basis of gender, race, class, ability that have had access to the kind of institutions and even the kind of rights that we have asked for as a movement have usually benefited more privileged LGBTI people in our ranks. And oftentimes that's upper middle class white gay men in many other studies that show these patterns also in this organization and leadership. And to some degree, also even in the story of queer migrants, which looks at, many times these are also transnational actors who then do have access to education or other kind of resources that enable them to do the kind of organizing work and also give time to work that's often volunteer-based, so have the biographical availability to do that and to write grants and communicate in different languages that isn't accessible to everyone. So we have to really keep that in mind. And I think, Marta and Magdalena's presentation before was looking also at activists who are less visible in this kind of work. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about these rights and the folks working behind them, that where privilege exists here. To come back to resistance, one of the things that's so central has been so central in this conference and has also unfortunately been so central in my own research on rights is that the norms that I've been discussing, how they're diffusing and spreading new rights, have they are moderated by the domestic context into which they diffuse, and it's really a diverse set of responses that states produce in terms of reaction to these norms, and especially nationalism has been. States that have high levels of nationalism has been really able to prescribe a high degree of threat to LGBTI rights because of the fluidity of gender, of sexuality, and gender identity are constructed as challenging the fixity of nation. And this is something that has been true of Poland and many other countries, I think also many countries that we've had presentations on in the Middle East, that there is, that these responses of threat perception exist, and that advocacy groups on the ground have to really carefully navigate. And oftentimes religion is also folded into national identity in a way that really prescribes a high degree of threat to LGBTI rights and presents them as something foreign imposition, something imposed that is challenging to the sovereignty and values of the state. And I think this image actually on this slide, which is this beautiful arch that existed in Warsaw, in a beautiful square in Warsaw for quite some time. And I think it's kind of symbolic of the struggle of this type of organizing, because it was an arch that, it was actually an artist exhibit, not directly, I think, associated with LGBTI rights, but it became perceived as a symbol of it. And it was burned down 6 different times and then re-put back together. And that's actually quite tedious work, given that those are little ribbons that make up that. So it was reconstructed 6 times. It's not there on the square anymore, but that time of this constant rebuilding of it, I think, is quite symbolic of what many movements are dealing with their resistance. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Polish resistance in a second, but here you see an image. This is from about 2010 by a right-wing organization. And what they're portraying here is, which they mean it kind of ironically to say, so they are the fascists on the one side, and you see kind of, quote unquote, normal looking Poles waving Polish flags. And on the other side, it says, and these are the Poles. And you see people who are depicted as LGBTI activists with a rainbow flag that says gay is okay. And then you see international symbols that kind of link it to this foreign, it's a construction of linking it to this foreign opposition. So you see it linked to the EU, which does make sense to some degree. And the activists were also using a lot of European symbols. In the mid-2000s, LGBTI activists were in Poland, but then you also see, for example, a Soviet Union flag, which was put there, and I think doesn't make much sense based on reality, but it's kind of this imagination that's put together of associating LGBTI rights with something foreign and something threatened and something opposed that the nation has to be defended from. And somewhat ironically or not, as Isa's presentation yesterday was an example of this as well, is that the success of the LGBTI movement is confronting a globalized resistance that is also working in a transnational way. So in part, what I presented at the beginning in terms of how certain activists work together, transnationally, transnational advocacy organization, they might be supported by some international organizations, like sometimes the EU or sometimes certain states advocate for LGBTI rights, that there is an opposition movement that works in a similar way, or at least functions across similar kinds of networks. And this is something we see in that there's a lot of resistance to LGBTI rights globally, and scholars have referred to this as norm polarization, in that you see on one hand, kind of the proliferation of LGBTI rights norms, which I talked about at the beginning, but then there's also increasingly the proliferation of other kinds of anti-gender, anti-LGBTI policies. So for example, like the so-called anti-gay propaganda legislation that we see cropping up in multiple states. And this is spearheaded by growing out of this kind of traditional values politics. It's spearheaded by several powerful states, and they work in a similar way. So you might have a state like Russia, which has been quite involved in this, but also international organizations are working in this, like the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church. And then transnational advocacy groups, like, for example, the World Congress of Families, which of course holds a lot of space for American Christian right activists that work together to diffuse different kinds of understandings and new concepts like quote unquote gender ideology, or as we heard it in the recent Polish elections last year, LGBTI ideology, which lumps together women's rights and rights around sexuality and gender identity in a kind of conglomeration of issues that is supposed to be opposed, and a return to, as I think Amanda put it today, as a return to some kind of an imagined past, that once existed. And this is something that we've seen in many different states. Actually, in the Trump administration, rolled back over 180 protections for LGBTI people, of course, disproportionately affecting trans people during that administration. And that continues on today. And this is something that we have to think about very carefully as we see this, especially in the last decade, growing with more careful coordination. And you see similar kinds of language as well being used in multiple contexts. You know, bathroom bills, which were famous in North Carolina, are also being used on chat groups in China to create a kind of panic around transgender rights, or LGBT rights popping up in Colombia around the FARC peace deal and really mobilizing an opposition in the same way they have in certain countries in Europe, all the way from France to Italy to Slovenia. So it's really an interesting and international dynamic. And actually, I'm in Berlin this week with a group that we're meeting with various parties in the German election. And one of the ones that we actually met was a member of the AfD yesterday morning, which is a far-right party, a radical right party in Germany. And it was really interesting listening to how he was constructing this panic around gender, what he called, quote unquote, gender ideology. And he kept talking about, a return to some kind of normality, which weirdly he thought, I guess, Germany was great in the 80s, which is what he was advocating we return back to. But he kept mentioning it as if there was something authentically German that was in opposition to so-called gender ideology. Yet all of the examples he gave were very familiar from other contexts. I had heard all of them in the US, kind of panic around education, like Marina was talking about in her presentation today, and introducing children to sex education or education around gender identity. A lot of language about fearness around political correctness and the use of pronouns, a lot of panic around many elements of LGBTI and women's movements that seem to be very internationally circulating, even though they were presented by him as if something belonging to a nationalist response local to this context. And that is a fascinating dynamic that we have in this, and troubling dynamic that we have in this globally circulating resistance. So what are movements doing about it? I want to use the last few minutes that I have for the final part, the fourth part, to talk about the way movements are framed. And I will go back to the Polish example here too. And this is a little bit earlier, because this study with Agnieszka Taj, we looked at framing of the movement, and we purposely used the term lesbian and gay movement because that's mainly how they referred to themselves at the time. And we look from 1987 to 2010. And of course, you had fantastic updates today from more recent strategies of the movement. But what was interesting about this language is how, about the framing in this history, just in one country, is how dynamically the movement has responded to different challenges, and how innovatively they have pushed against, in the struggle across various periods. And what you see is that, and I'll break this down in a couple slides in a second, but at the beginning, in the 90s, there was this use of a human rights language that was pulling a lot from universal master frames that were used in many different contexts, emphasizing principles of equality and rights. Also, at the time, of course, democracy was very normal, very common, and this idea of normality in terms of returning to normality, which was a frame used, or returning to democracy, or returning to Europe, that associated with a Polish independence. And it would shift then to kind of educational frames, using also kind of similar to the American model, where they talk a lot about anti-discrimination, anti-homophobia. What's very interesting about that was that there were no culprits that were identified. It was just this homophobia was something just floating around that we needed to teach people about, but it wasn't really targeting or diagnosing a problem that it was coming from anyone in an attempt to teach people about sexuality. And then there was also the entry of Poland into the European Union in May of 2004, also, when there was quite a bit of enthusiasm around that, provided a language for the movement to say that this is part of European values and human rights responsibilities. Yet what happened then around 2003, 4, 5, when the really intense opposition emerged, that was claiming that the movement was introducing foreign language or was a foreign imposition, was that the movement really reoriented itself to a more rooted language, which I'll explain to you in a second. And I thought this is a really innovative and interesting turn in how movements respond. And just to map it theoretically, what you see here was kind of a use of universal and external master frames that then, when a counter movement emerged, it pulled the movement's frames down to kind of a more rooted and national language to counter and dispel the accusation of foreignness. So what you had then in the end was a diversification of some of the older frames that came to coexist with a new kind of language. So let me just briefly show you these. So the earlier frames in the 90s, again, focusing a lot on human rights and democratization. And then on the turn of the new century, this kind of educational frame. And so you were wanting to teach about, the movement was wanting to teach about homophobia and about discrimination and about LGBT people as minorities. And since Poland is a quite homogenous country, they were referred to as the largest minority in Poland. So using a kind of minoritizing language that we have around minority rights in other countries. And then they identified as the culprit for homophobia, it was mainly ignorance. So that people were, that the reason we had homophobia was just because of ignorance and not knowing enough yet. And then there were also these, like, for example, this campaign, which was a quite really important campaign by KPH, the main LGBTI rights organization focused. It was called Let Them See Us, which was kind of introducing couples on billboards across various cities. And then, of course, the movement was using a lot of European Union rights language. Yet when a counter movement emerged, and it was a very organized and intense opposition of political homophobia around that time, it introduced this discourse. And it's a discourse that I think that many LGBTI movements have to respond to in various parts of the globe. And this rhetoric included elements of pathologization, strong references to religion and tradition, and an emphasis on defending the family and protecting children from a foreign imposition. And these morality politics were organized a lot around the theme of nationalism, and actually even support at the time for the EU amongst certain center-right elements of the society left little room for LGBTI activists, because Pope John Paul II actually was in favor of European integration because he saw Poland as a vehicle for bringing Catholicism back to a decadent European Union to basically evangelize east to west the European Union. And this created then little space for LGBTI organizers who said that they were seen as kind of a stain on the this moral imperative of the state to deliver this, and that it created this really intense counter movement against them. And it was then there were elements later that became critical of EU accession that also viewed the EU as a factor of demoralization of the Polish nation. And some of the groups there were the League of Polish Families, were also in political power, and then the All Polish Youth, which was very, very organized. So what the movement did to respond to this was to discover, first to discover opponents and really kind of call out elements of society that they saw as responsible for politicizing homophobia. And they started referring to their work as an intense struggle, and also worked on reclaiming memory of Polish political history and using a kind of almost mirroring language that they used elements of the charge against them from the counter movement to try to flip it around. So they wanted to challenge the constant accusation of foreignness by emphasizing Polishness. And so there were a lot of examples of this kind of a rooting around certain kind of religious themes, sometimes in certain elements of their marches, like Love Thy Neighbor, or using the Polish flag instead of the EU one. And there's actually one example. I'll just read you a quote from a 2006 march in Krakow, March for Tolerance, where a Polish flag was used, and then an activist from the lesbian and gay movement said, in fact, it's really strange to see the Polish flag covered in eggs, because people who love or who are supposed to love Poland threw eggs at the Polish flag. And this is something to show the public that the flag was vandalized, not by us, but by the other side. So it was a way to kind of show who the patriots were. And there's actually been a similar, other interviews I've had in Hungary and other countries, that sometimes these, when the opposition defiles these national symbols the movement uses, it creates, it makes it harder for them to navigate this, this narrative that the counter movement uses as defenders of the nation. And I think that, a lot of these kind of innovative strategies that the movement has used, sometimes also when, Pavel and Tomasz were talking about vulgar humor today, that was very common at that time in the mid-2000s as well. And obviously their presentation showed this really, beautiful and innovative slogans, and in this cardboard activism that shows new waves of the movement. I just want to show a couple examples of rooting from, this was around 2015-16, and you can see, for example, the logo of KPH. Actually, no activist actually told me that this was strategic, so I don't know about this particular case, but it is the borders of the Polish nation, which I think kind of suggests, compared to its older logo, a kind of national rooting. But the other campaign, which was "Let us offer each other a sign of peace," that's kind of what you say to each other in Catholic Mass. Their activists told me that this was really trying to resonate and broker a kind of language that could create a space for dialogue with Catholic Poles, not with the Catholic Church directly, but it was a campaign where activists talked about, Catholic LGBTI people talked about their experiences, and also Catholic straight people who had become allies spoke out in this campaign. And what you see there is it's resonant not only for that's what you say in Mass, but activists explained it to me as also that there being a letter from Polish bishops in 1965 that was sent to German bishops, marking the 20-year end of the Second World War, and that was resonant in Poland as a kind of reconciliation, or kind of saying 20 years have passed since the war and it's time to move forward. And so this was an attempt, using more national themes that the movement tried to use. Of course, all of these tactics come with some controversy, and there's different opinions within the movement on if they're good strategies or not. But I thought it's interesting to point out some creative ways that movements respond to the oppositions that they face. I know that I want to leave a little bit of time, and I think I've just hit my 40 minutes right now. So I will turn over the time to my organizers and let them take it from here.
Philip, perhaps you can tell us what this last picture is about?
Oh, this picture?
Yeah.
This is just a picture that I took at a, this was in Warsaw in 2010 at the EuroPride, which was when there was the EuroPride organization held their EuroPride in Warsaw. It was very important having it in Central Europe, and there were a lot of academic conferences or some academic talks organized around it, and there was activists coming from all over Europe to it, and that was really interesting in this form of kind of transnational organization. It was a very hot day, and at one point somebody opened kind of one of the water hoses so that people could cool off, and this was just kind of a nice moment that I thought of kind of celebration. There were also some opposition to this event, and there was a lot of counter movements as well that were using even the Battle of Grunwald that happened a long time ago between Poles and Teutonic Knights that were used as a way to kind of oppose this. But this was one of these moments of levity and kind of enjoying the cool water that we felt in the march. And so I like that picture, and I used it a lot kind of randomly here at the end.
Thank you. Thank you for the excellent presentation. So for the participants who would like to put their questions, there is a Q&A section that you can write your questions there, and I can read it to Philip. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I mean, you took us to tour de force about what's going on in Europe on multiple levels, including solidarity across borders, migration, resistance and resilience, quantitative, qualitative research. Thank you so much for all this information, and that helped me to think in different ways. And one of the things that attracted me, also took my attention in this conference, when we were discussing organizing the conference, and also in the first day of the conference, there were participants, people who wanted, the scholars or activists who wanted to participate in this conference, but they couldn't, because they were afraid of the consequences from their own governments. And they were also, some of them raised the fact they were frustrated because they also wanted to get more resonance from European countries, European governments, European activists to reach out to them. But they didn't have enough exchange. So in your research, I was wondering, or maybe in your coming research with Saeed Atshan, I was wondering whether you are going to talk about these kind of transnational levels between the Middle East and Europe, in terms of activism, in terms of how government policies can influence solidarity across borders.
Thank you so much for that question. And yes, I want to loop Saeed in at some point, not today, I guess, but to answer this question with me. But yes, that's exactly what we want to do. And that's a core part of our project, is to think about how these networks might exist also through diaspora networks to Europe that connect the regions, and how this also disseminates new understandings, not just wholesale transfer of ways that things have been done here, but really renegotiates how some of this work is done. And in terms of these networks existing and how they're levied, it's a really tricky double-edged sword of how to help, because a lot of times activists also don't want the kind of visibility politics or the kind of pressure or the kind of insistence of a government on introducing a law, because it can also it can introduce violence or threat to LGBTI communities or queer communities in those contexts. So this is always navigated in different ways, and that's actually why these norm brokers I think of as so important, because they really give cues also in terms of how transnational advocacy networks should respond, how governments should respond. And there's, I'm working on a separate project right now on LGBTI foreign policy, where we're looking at best practices. And this is something that I have to say, even diplomats, who sometimes make mistakes, that have seemed to come to understand how very sensitive it is to do this kind of work around LGBTI rights in a transnational way, because there's certain things that are welcome in one context that really don't work in another, or that might be seen as having the reverse output in another. So there needs to be on the ground activists who are navigating and guiding the process of how that works. And hopefully increasing networks exist through organizations, so like ILGA Asia, for example, which includes Middle Eastern countries, and ILGA Europe, which are under the ILGA umbrella. This is just one example of a transnational advocacy network, but it's the longest enduring one. It's been around since 1978 in the ILGA World Formation, and it comes off the heels of other organizations that were transnational in the late 1800s and also in the homophile activism period of the 1950s. But the ILGA is the one that has, that's still around, and it's been around since 1978, and it does provide networks where when there is a crisis moment in a country, activists on the ground there can engage and provide advice to their networks of how to respond.
I really appreciated when you said that these are transnational movements, but they have to adapt themselves to local situations. I really appreciated that you give this emphasis on the local situation may be different and not necessarily Westocentric, but it's got its own dynamics. Thank you for the information about ILGA as well. I have one more question, and as you might have also followed in the summer, there were some speculations in the media about what's going to happen in Hungary. The backlash in Hungary against gender studies, against LGBTQ, and whether expelling some countries from the European Union because they are not fitting into some of the basic, I'm not saying all the European Union is fantastic in terms of LGBTQ rights, but some countries are worse than others. What do you say? What kind of pressure can the European Union put on countries like this that are openly against some of the norms of the European Union?
That's a really great question. So the Hungarian case, so this was a kind of one of these laws, kind of like the so-called gay propaganda law that was limiting some information around LGBTI people to anyone under 18, which kind of effectively moves the conversations out of the public space. And this, it has its unique form in Hungary compared to other places, but it was seen as definitely a violation of many principles of EU values. And there was a really interesting response there. And I think part of the response was this kind of savior response that we saw in Germany and many other places where activists were saying we have to help, or even in the soccer game at the European Championships, folks were wearing rainbow flags and activists stormed the field and the Munich stadium. There was a big scandal about whether it could light up its stadium in rainbow lights. And what was interesting about it was twofold. One is that it created a conversation at home in many countries that actually, even in Germany, for example, even like CDU, CSU politicians were speaking on LGBTI rights, even though having themselves voted against those rights in the German parliament, having limited important legislation on trans recognition in Germany just a few months before. And so it placed a lot of pressure, homegrown pressure from the politicians in other countries that were saying things like this, and it could lead to then also changes in Germany, France, et cetera, by calling out hypocrisy. That's something that happens a lot in transnational activism. And then comes the question of pressure on Hungary. And I thought, two things were interesting there. One was that in Hungary, we had major mobilization amongst Hungarians who took to the streets to protest this themselves. And sometimes they were overshadowed a little bit in this kind of savior narrative in Western Europe of how we have to come in with certain standards. And I think that that was a negative aspect of this response, in that there was a lot of grassroots important activism going on there. And a lot of companies, for example, that put rainbow flags for Hungary up in Germany and France didn't do it in Hungary itself. So they also faced then pressure from activists on the ground that were calling out these kind of hypocrisies. The other thing that I thought was quite interesting about it at the EU level was that sorry, this is a long answer, but in the Council in the European Union, there was a heated discussion about it. And I guess, according to reports, there was even a confrontation of Orban by other leaders that were pressing on this issue. Yet when the EU decided, when the Commission decided to put pressure on Hungary, they don't mention LGBTI people so specifically. And this is something that, again, is pretty interesting about this kind of conditionality, that they focused more on corruption, on rule of law, but they wanted to make sure, and I think this was a good move through the advice of civil society, was that we don't want to feel LGBTI people being the center of the blame then of any kind of sanction coming towards Hungary. So in a way, in the eventual output, they were made a little bit invisible in that process, even though the law against LGBTI rights was centrally motivating to the response. And so this was kind of another, interesting complexity of this transnational activism. I think of how it's done in real time has to be done with great care.
Yes, thank you so much. Although you're in international relations, I really appreciate that you put the emphasis on the local movements.
Always.
Yes, and also yesterday when we were talking about Turkey, the situation in the difficult situation in Turkey. If we are talking about the Istanbul Convention right now, or women's rights right now, there are a lot of local women lawyers that made it possible that it actually came to the parliament, and some laws have been passed. I also wanted to acknowledge their importance in talking about women's rights in Turkey today. So you have two questions, and they're actually very similar, and they came at the same time from two of our participants. One of them is the co-organizer of the conference, Tunay. Tunay asks, what do you think about upcoming German election and its possible outcomes on Germany's position on minority rights? And perhaps you can combine this question with Pavel's question on, who is thanking you for this presentation, and he's asking whether, do you think the situation of queer feminist rights is going to get worse in Central Eastern Europe, sorry.
Those are great questions, and also from two great presenters. I really enjoyed both of your presentations earlier in the conference. Let me start with Tunai. So with the election in Germany, that's actually an interesting question. And I'm a little bit more optimistic in that so in March of this year, the German government, even under the CDU-SPD coalition, announced their new effort on an LGBTI inclusion strategy and foreign policy, which is putting a lot of pressure, I think, on kind of articulating certain standards and getting the Germans more involved, hopefully in a sensitive and careful, do no harm kind of way, in a way that they haven't been before. And this is something that I don't think will get rolled back with any new government. I mean, things are very kind of razor thin now in terms of what the outcome might be. We don't know for sure, but it looks like, if anything, it will be maybe a more left government, or at least a government not including parties that have more opposition to LGBT rights than they do now with the CDU-CSU. So I think an initiative like that would carry on even if the CDU-CSU is in the government, given that the federal government that they were involved in already started that process, and potentially could be even accelerated, and maybe more could be done in many other frontiers of LGBTI rights in Germany, if we have, for example, the traffic light coalition between the SPD, Greens, and FDP. So we'll see a little bit, but I think the left party and the Green Party have definitely the most kind of innovative approaches of LGBT rights on their platform. I think the SPD does to some degree as well, and would be a good partner. So I think I feel a little optimistic that things could be good on that front after the election, but we'll see what happens. And then when it comes to Pavel's question, this is really a tricky one, and I think sometimes we have a lot of, rightly have so much bad news in the press about what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe because of these really kind of intense retrenchment of rights that have come with, populist nationalist movements in various states. And there's been just, I think, terrible news over and over again. And a lot of the kind of progress and excitement we saw, for example, Poland around gender recognition, or when Anna Grodzka was elected and Robert Biedron in 2011, and we saw getting very close to even partnership and getting the gender recognition through the parliament, but then being vetoed by the new president. It put a big kind of wet blanket, I think, on a lot of our hope for change. Yet at the same time, there's a couple things that I think we should keep in mind, and your presentation really did a lot of that with this really, really important mobilization that we see, and that attitudes actually towards LGBTI people have over the last 2 decades improved amongst the population. It's a very divided context, much like the US, but you see that much more engagement with LGBTI rights by nearly half the population. Even in the presidential election, which I think from activist perspective was pretty tepid with Trzaskowski, but he also included LGBTI rights to some degree in the presidential election. And so I think that the movement is keeping the pressure on. And I think that I feel a little bit, instead of just all bad news, I want to hold on to a little bit of hope that this galvanization, that this kind of threat that we've had in Poland and in other Central and Eastern European countries, can continue to galvanize an opposition that is actually, changing minds and keeping pressure on their governments that could then hopefully eventually lead to better outcomes. That might be unsatisfying answer, and I'm sorry, but it's just the best I can do.
Thank you so much for the answers, Philip. I don't see any other questions, and we are coming to the end of our time. This was a terrific presentation. Thank you very much. It was also, you touched upon a lot of presentations from the conference as well and put them together. So this was a good finishing conversation for our conference as well. Great keynote. Thank you and congratulations. I would like to call my co-organizers to the screen so that we can finish up for today. And Thank you so much, Philip. As you see in the chat, everybody's thanking you for the invitation. Yeah. So this was a very interesting conference in many ways. First of all, it was amazing to cover so many different countries, which have similarities and differences altogether. And also we had two great keynotes from Deniz Kandiyoti and Phillip Ayoub, which touched upon different parts of the themes that we were discussing today. I took a lot of notes. Some of the notes I took, for example, to think about sexuality as disrupting the social order. And this is one of the themes that came out in many different presentations, and how, for example, something that we take for granted today, sexual education in Germany, is seen as a threat to the government's national security in some other parts of Europe. One of the themes that also attracted attention attracted my attention is the resilience and resistance causing burnout in digital activism. For example, I never thought about it that so many people who are trying to be active in the Middle East through the only mean that they have, because many of the streets are close to them, is digital activism, and how this actually affects these activist movements, because they are also, having difficulties in seeing the impact of their activisms, and many of them are having mental health problems, or this is causing burnout. So this was also a part that I didn't think about before, and it also shows how complex this is. And when we scratch the surface, we see individual and social consequences of resistance from LGBTQ communities. And we also covered a whole bunch of institutions, from social media, from digital activism to universities, to other political structures, and as Deniz Kandiyoti also said in the keynote, how this is a gendered violence that is diffused within the institutions of various countries, and also in transnational levels. This was also a very interesting takeaway message that I took from this conference. One of the things that I emphasized again and again in different kinds of presentations, for example, in Philip's and also Katayun and Mahtab's excellent presentation, is the feminist alliances with the right wing. And these kind of uncanny alliances causing anti-immigrant movements, we see again and again, but it's been theorizing this was also interesting to see that this is a phenomena that's going on both in the Middle East and in Europe at the same time. So I'm not going to say that we're going to conclude this conference with specific messages, but it's been, for me, very empowering as a scholar to talk about these themes in a transnational manner. And I would like to thank all the presenters and the excellent keynotes, and my co-organizers and the organizing team, Bella and Frankie, for being there and for helping us. And of course, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Heinrich Böll Foundation, for supporting us in the organization of this conference. And thank you very much. I'm very grateful that you were there for us. You are there for us. It's amazing to know that we have scholars around the world who have similar ideas and who are there when we need them. I'm going to give the word to Nadia Alali, Katarina Galor, and Tunay Altay one by one to thank in order to make the last concluding speeches. Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll be very quick because I know we're running out of time. First, Philippe, this was amazing. Thanks so much. Yeah, I would like to mention actually our center's administrator, Barbara Oberkötter, who has been a great help in conference, and of course, many, many other people, including Frankie and Bella. Now, I guess just in terms of content, I mean, I'd started out by saying that for me, it's really important to de-exceptionalize the Middle East and also to provincialize Europe. And I think the conference just made that even more poignant. And I think for all of us, who are sort of linked to some kind of area studies, obviously it's important to have the historical and empirical context, and context matters. But I think it's also important to push ourselves out of these sort of nation state or regional boundaries and look more comparatively and look where the parallels are. So, and, you know, for someone who is interested in authoritarianism and militarism in the Middle East, I mean, I think more so now than ever, I've always kind of known as a feminist scholar that a gender perspective is central, but now I really, really also have internalized that a focus on sexuality and challenging heteronormativity is central as well. And I think, you know, another thing that's sort of a take back for me is, you know, queer studies. We're also contributing to queer studies. I mean, historically, there is a kind of Western bias, and of course, queer of color theory, you know, has challenged, you know, some of the kind of, you know, original theorizing. But, you know, I think that increasingly we also find that as much as we need to focus on gender and sexuality as angles of analysis to understand wider developments, really a queer, especially queer feminist lens, is a lens that allows us to look at everything, whether it is citizenship, whether it's migration, you know, whether it's racism, whether it's refugees. And I feel like this is actually, for me, probably one of the most exciting frameworks there is right now that challenges, that's not only intersectional in you know, and not in a sort of crude, just taking, you know, a model, but really looking what are the specific inequalities in any context. But that's also really challenging polarized binaries that are being constructed as we speak across the political spectrum. And on that note, yeah, I'd like to ask my colleague Kati, and also of course thank all of you participants and my co-organizers for this wonderful experience. And as you said, we hope that it's the beginning of a longer process. Kati, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, really just a few words, because I really feel that both of you have laid out the most important things brilliantly. I just want to say that I think 2 years ago, pre-COVID, we would not have thought it possible to do such a conference. Throughout this past year or year and a half, we've been meeting via Zoom regularly, and it has become really normal and very, very easy to do this to organize this international conference across 2 continents, meeting regularly, and then really allowing us also to bring in scholars from various places in the world, including Europe and the Middle East and the US. So I think this COVID has done something that is good for activism in the queer world, but also for scholarship. The only thing I would like to add is that I really, really, really regret, despite the fact that you really made the best out of technology and a Zoom conference, bringing music into it and many other things that I think made it really very manageable to participate in so many sessions after session, but I really do regret not being able to hang out socially with a whole group of wonderful participants. It would be so much fun to go out now together and just continue in a more informal way. And I hope that we can at least compensate by staying in touch virtually, by working together on a publication or publications, and to perhaps also find various ways to stay in touch. So thank you so much to everybody. And
thank you.
Tunai, you are, we would love for you to have the last word.
Last words, wow, okay, now this has been the spotlight, but I'll just echo your comments, and I'll just say that this conference was also very informative for me, and at the same time very empowering. As the most junior co-organizer among you all, I learned a lot from you, your organizing style, and at the same time from our keynote speakers, our opening panelists, our participants. it was just a very empowering process, also as an LGBTQ migrant scholar who was born and raised in Turkey and now currently in Berlin. It's just like bringing together these perspectives and talks and empirical work, research, writing, emotions from both Middle East and Europe. It was just very meaningful for me. And I guess like one of the many highlights for me was also the performance by Faris Amin and the musical interlude we had, and also like including activists and journalists into what is traditionally considered as an academic conference. So I think it is what also Anne Phoenix called yesterday. This is like transforming academia, which is happening by these little steps. So I'm happy that we were brave enough to take this little step together and maybe change something about what we know about like academic conferences or academic knowledge sharing. So it was really beautiful to share this moment with you all. Thank you again for the audience as well for your questions. And yeah, I hope to continue to like bringing in more queer feminist perspectives.
Okay, we will have a website continuing this conversation, hopefully. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.